Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. I hope that you find this of value. I would like to spend some time talking to you about how to conduct research. But it's important, I think about like when we talk about a PhD, which is what we're really talking about at this point in terms of conducting research, or even if you're a junior faculty starting your career, we have to think about what is the purpose of research? The purpose of research isn't simply, oh, it's one more thing I have to do to complete a PhD. It isn't simply something I have to do to earn tenure or get promoted. It is, in fact, contribution to society. And you think about many of the great scientific discoveries where people's lives have been saved by the discovery of antibiotics. We work in business. And so people don't think about the impact of the research we do, but truthfully, it's enormous. The quality of life in the decades that I've seen, from all the way through from the 50s to now, is greatly improved. A simple example is the ability to buy goods and services at a price that is improved the standard of living for everyone because we figured out how to manufacture and deliver those products at a much better price. And these are things that come out of business research, as do improvement of products and many other things. So in order to move the science and research forward, you must publish. So the objective isn't simply to do a good study, but the objective is to disseminate the results of that study in a venue where other researchers will see it and use it. And I say it that way because it does vary with disciplines as to where that venue should be. And so what that means is, there are people who work on the cutting edge of computer science who frequently disseminate initially in conferences. In the business colleges, we try to go to referee journals and then we tend to rank these journals and have better journals. The better the journal, typically, the better the impact because the greater the dissemination. So again, the objective is to conduct your research, to do so with ethics and high quality results, and to publish that. So I'm always thinking about like what is required to do this research effectively and publish it. And so that's really the keystone of this talk, how to develop that research and what you have to do. So I talk about, a standard talk. I have an agenda. I have planning the research, how you conduct methodology, the design and execution, and ultimately the writing and presentation. But even that is an art. You don't just write your research. You literally have to start to go back and forth with target journals mentally and determine the way in which you write and present it, which will change from journal to journal. So this is highly specific, and anything I say that seems counter to something you're doing could potentially be that we're simply talking about a relatively narrow focus here, and there are lots of variations. But good research is classically done a certain way. And at the very macro level, it always starts with how we think about what we want to accomplish. So it's understanding that it's a systematic approach, that we look for research opportunities in a variety of ways. The classic way for some scientists is to look through the literature, but it's not the only way. Industry informs us of things they're interested in. Opportunity presents itself through serendipity. It could be, somebody in manufacturing and they're having a particular issue with a product that they're developing. And then you can conduct research related to that. It could be delivery of products if we're talking about supply chain. So it's not all just engineering, it's not all science. There's many different things that go into it. The key elements of design, what is the research question? Usually this is iteratively developed. What do I mean? you have an idea where you want to do your research. You know, Shaquille and I talked about a project and we started to develop it and we started thinking about collecting data. And ultimately he changed to a different project because it fit better with what he was doing, his work aspirations, because he was working full time while completing his PhD, and he's very close. And we are talking about, before most of you got on, a publication, because in his college you have to have 2 publications to defend your dissertation. So that second one is about to close, and then we will continue on the research that we're doing and aspire for even better journals, because the timing for very high quality journals is a much longer period. How you develop your writing skills and your presentation skills. The best research written poorly does not typically get in good journals. It's unfortunate, but it is the world we live in. So we can talk about, organizing existing research. We can do that through a table. We can do, you can do that through series of paragraphs where you synthesize the literature and kind of integrate it. It depends on the problem as to which method works best, but basically you have to conduct an organized, structured lit review in your topics preferably, if you have access, in a library database, ProQuest, EBSCOhost, particular sets of journals, possibly Google Scholar. I know a lot of people turn to Google Scholar. It's not the best. There's nothing wrong with using it. I tend to use it just initially when I'm exploring a problem, but I don't tend to use it for my final lit review because it's not as complete and as inclusive as the EBSCOhost, the ProQuest, the big ABI Informs, the big integrated databases. Now, that said, not everybody in every country has access to those. And so I belong to ResearchGate, and I have researchers who send me, who find my articles and then don't have access and send requests, and I send them a copy for academic use, for their private use in conduct of their research. So there are other ways. It's just not as convenient as if your university provides you with a library, and don't minimize the value of that, even though there's other ways to access libraries. All right, so the next thing is, how do you look at the research that's come out? If you're working in business, we frequently talk about theoretical frameworks. What theory are you building on? What are the antecedents of those, dependent variables? And then how do you examine each of those? Now, typically, I'm talking in the context of survey research, but it doesn't have to be survey. This is applicable in the very highest level to mathematical modeling, to simulation. Some of the mechanics will vary, but you still have to have a defined problem. You have to have conducted an appropriate synthesis of prior research. You have to figure out what theory applies, whether you're doing simulation, mathematical modeling, whether you're doing survey research, whether you're doing longitudinal studies. All of these still have much of these same elements. And then you have to decide what methodology you're using. How am I going to look at the data? Is it going to be a qualitative study where I interview people? Back to Shaquille, he's done that. Kashif has as well. Or do I survey people? Or do I do both and integrate them? How do I analyze the data? Do I do latent semantic analysis? Do I do sentiment analysis? Do I do a more typical qualitative study where I use something like NVivo or QDMax to kind of classify the response rates in different topics? Eventually, you begin to recognize patterns in what exists in the literature, what exists in your data, and then you can use that to address the research gap. But going back, that research gap unfolds. What do I mean by research gap? So when you identify a problem, whether it be in industry or it be in the literature, you believe there's something that hasn't been addressed before. You have an obligation to look in the literature to see what other people have done relevant to that particular topic and that narrow question. Now, don't be, I have a student who was working on distribution of flu vaccine. And we were getting data from a large hospital organization and a group of doctors about how they ordered, and we were trying to optimize the way they order and manage because the vaccine is no longer good after a period of time. And then we were using some kind of modeling, a classic news vendor application, to figure out the distribution of vaccine and the timing and larger distribution. So I'm mentioning this because what if somebody had already done that? Even if they had looked at distribution of flu vaccine, did they actually do the modeling the way we did? And if we did it differently, what did it bring to the table? What did it bring to the research stream that hadn't been done before? Now, back to this idea of disseminating research, and what I mean by research stream, it's not just about the publication. I view publication as this ongoing dialogue among scientists. It's not just I'm publishing to publish. I'm publishing because other scientists and practitioners are going to read this, and then they're going to think about, does it apply to their problem? And then they're going to hopefully use it and improve it and publish things about those improvements so that we continue to move the science forward collectively as a group. So if you think about the way I think about this idea of conducting research and publishing, that's what I mean by a dialogue among scientists. Each of us contributing, each of us adding new ideas and continuously improving the process. So how do we plan?
Dr. Viktor, if you don't mind, can we take a quick pause for question and answers here? Is
Sure.
that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Folks, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and ask. It's a very comforting and very welcoming session today. Nobody's going to object to your question. Don't worry what kind of question you're asking. Of course, it should be relevant to this topic of today's webinar. So any question, anybody wants to ask anything to Dr. Viktor so far for the material that he has covered so far?
So who's monitoring the chat, Shaquille?
I'm also monitoring along with Mutahir.
So
And
that's
if you
another
guys want
thing.
to, yeah, if you want to have a question asked in the chat, please feel free to ask question in the chat
Exactly.
box.
Just type them into the chat. Shaquille will alert me that there's a question relevant to what I'm talking about, and I'll be happy to answer it. That way you don't have to speak out, or if you don't choose to. And I don't mind if you ask as well.
Yeah, you can continue, Dr. Viktor. Thank you.
All right, happy to do so. All right, so basically, again, you're a researcher, you're a doctoral student, you're an assistant professor. It doesn't matter. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm in the same boat. I have an idea of something I think is important. I have to think through, well, how am I going to do that research? What is the exact research area? What is the question? And ultimately, I want to get it down to what I'll call a testable hypothesis. It's a little different in qualitative research, but still, I think in terms of what is the narrow question that I can collect data and have a response for. And this is important, especially for beginning research, because there's a tendency to make that question too broad. And if it's too broad, then you can't answer it precisely. You're really trying to be very narrow in terms of your contribution so that it's clearly defined, so that you have the data that's been collected. So one of the things I said is you got to find an initial problem, whether it came from was initiated by practitioners or something you observed or it came out of the literature itself, you've got to then explore it to determine that it actually has significance in terms of contribution to the science. Now, the term more frequently used is theoretical significance. The next thing is, okay, if it's got theoretical significance, particularly in business applications, we have some obligation to say that this has some application in the real world, that it, a physicist may ultimately still think about the real world, but a theoretical physicist or mathematician has less constraints in terms of saying this is going to apply. Not that they don't think this, they may, but the point is, when we work in business research, we really do think about, well, how are people in practice going to use this, whether it be some company in manufacturing, whether it be a service or good that we're delivering, so that it becomes actionable insights. Healthcare research is very popular now. It's an area I work in because my spouse is a healthcare researcher. And so I noticed that a lot of people are working in that area. So one of the other things is the feasibility of conducting the research. It's all well and good to say I'm going to collect data, and that if I could get 100 chief information officers to answer my survey, probably need even more than 100, but let's just say that, I could analyze this and contribute. But the odds of getting 100 CIOs to answer is really very small. Even not most students don't even have access to CIOs. Shaquille's been in industry for a number of years. He has access to people with experience. He probably couldn't get 100 to do a survey. I had another one who was a vice president, but then you think through, okay, but I have friends, I have people I know who would be willing to cooperate. Then potentially you decide to do qualitative research where the number of respondents is much lower and the data is richer, and you can do interviews. So you have to think through data accessibility. And I talked about surveys. Some people say, well, I want to get secondary data. All well and good, but like, for example, I'm working on a project using Medicare, Medicaid data in the United States, NHATS data, that's collected for the last 15 years. But I can only answer with that data the information relevant to the questions they've collected. And I've poured over the 1,200, 1,600 variables that are in the data set, depending on how you classify the variables. And I've tried to figure out, well, do they have a measure of depression? This is surveys conducted of people who are 65 plus. And is there a measure of depression? Is there a measure of physical activity? Yes and no. It's not what I would want ideally, but it's what they collect. They have some variables that look at depression, and when I analyze them, they don't factor analyze properly. So then I looked at all the other items. So I'm just trying to point out, you can conduct your own survey, has some value. For the very top journals, you would have to conduct survey over time. You can take panel data like the NHATS data, where they have a population that answers the survey year 1, and some of the same ones in year 2, and some of the same ones in year 3. These are 65 plus people. Over many years, several of them die, but they keep adding new people. So but that said, it's secondary data, and it doesn't exactly get everything I would like. So there's always trade-offs and so you might say, well, I have this research question, and then it leads to this research hypothesis. And then you might say, I can't answer it with this data set. So you have a choice. Do I use a different method? I've done that. When I started my own dissertation, I was doing mathematical modeling. I could not figure out the answer. So I did simulation to get an approximation. Interestingly enough, I then analyzed the simulation data and figured out a mathematical approximation that worked and published it, not on the dissertation, it was post-dissertation work, but I wouldn't have figured it out if I hadn't first done the simulation. You see, this is my point. Research is iterative. You're building. But there's also this kind of recursive process where you go back and re-examine I can't answer that question. Can I modify the question? Can I still get something of value relevant to my original research area if I collect data in a different way?
Dr. Victor, two
Yes.
questions. So one question for those who have no research experience, first time they've been asked either because of their master's program requirement or
Yep.
PhD dissertation requirement. They are about to harp on to the research work. Where to start from for a brand new blank
Good.
minded person?
So there's two thoughts on this. A lot of my colleagues say, go read the top journals, Financial Times 50 articles in your discipline. I don't think that's always the best way to start, because you read 1,000 articles, you have 1,000 ideas all rolling around, but it's not that focused. I believe, and this is my view, that the learning research is an apprenticeship process, that you find a senior researcher that is working in an area that interests you, that is actively not only doing the research, but publishing that research, so that you know that they're similarly motivated to conduct the research and complete the research. And then you work with that person in your area. They will help guide you. They will, the term now is mentor you. They will help shape you in terms of doing these things. Now, ultimately, you still got to go back to the literature. You still have to read. You still have to refine your question. But working with an experienced researcher who's already conducting research is the best way to learn. It's kind of like, I used to learn a lot of things out of books. I know now you go to YouTube. I do too. But it's like I want to learn to play tennis, and so I get a book on tennis. Well, you can only go so far in learning tennis in a book. It really is helpful to get there on the court and play with somebody who can show you some things, right? And so I'm simplifying for the benefit of trying to get you to understand that there's a certain amount of independence you want, and there's a certain amount of pursuing your own idea, but there's also a certain amount of interaction and guidance that becomes valuable and will help you become successful. And so I think that's the best advice that I can give you. In the absence of having someone guide you, then I think the next best thing is to find an area that interests you and get increasingly focused on what can I do in this research area that hasn't been done before, by going back to the literature and finding something and figuring out how you can pursue it. But I think that's a very difficult task to pursue on your own and time consuming. I certainly didn't get an enormous amount of guidance. So it's not like I think, oh, you got to, like in some lab environments, your mentor is working in a lab, they do this kind of research, they investigate cotton seeds, and you come into the lab and study cottonseed and you conduct research on cottonseed. But I'm not suggesting it has to be that narrow. It has to be, that you're interested in a particular area. In my case, I was interested in modeling risk assessment, and I worked with an advisor who had been doing risk assessment around nuclear power plants with mathematical modeling. And then I figured out some variant of that I wanted to do, which was to compare leukemia incidence risk for coal versus nuclear power, radionuclide risk assessment. It's a long way to get there, but you got to start with somebody who has some idea of what research is and how you conduct it. And that you got to select. We talk about theories, the prior literature, or what's been done before. What theories exist that are relevant? How do the theories explain what you're doing? And I'm trying to get this thing out of your picture. So there, that should help.
It does. Dr. Victor, if you allow me to ask one more related question.
Sure, take your time.
Yeah, so thank you. One question asked by Arsalan Ahmed, he said, what's the shortest way to find research gap? And I would probably add to that question, what is the most optimal way, rather than saying shortest way, what is the most optimal way to find the research gap?
So there's no one optimal way. Somebody could say, oh, this is in the literature, it suggests this problem, you start down that path and it works out for you. Shaquille, think about your own situation. You started working, Scrum Masters and doing that, and it looked, it could have easily continued, but you fell into an environment where another problem seemed more interesting in terms of the practical importance, what you were doing, and so you learned enough in the first iteration to quickly move from, because now you had already developed a set of research skills, that you quickly developed the research gap and the problems when you changed. But I don't think that would have happened as quickly if we hadn't started working with, Charles earlier on the other area, because you develop the skills and the expertise. So there's no, you could get lucky, and just, I think this idea and everything in the literature supports it, but more than likely, this is a iterative building process that takes, I don't know, I mean, optimistically 6 months, 3 months of effort.
And I agree with you, and I'll echo that, Arslan. From my perspective, my experiences, and Dr. Kashif Said, he's also on the call. He's a UNT professor, very very good friend of mine. Kashif, please feel free to chime in here. But I think you should have a broader idea of what you are thinking about as far as what kind of problem you want to solve from the research perspective, and then you have to read a lot, and you have to consult advisory, as Dr. Victor was saying. I mean, I got a lot of tips from him at the initial stage of my research. So find people who have done research and have published research extensively. Those people will give you a lot of small tips that look small, but they will change and expedite and optimize your journey towards finding the right kind of area of research and the research gap and all that good stuff.
That's right. If you work with somebody who's experienced, little things they tell you could take years to learn. That's the reality.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
because you learn them by trial and error rather than relying on somebody who can help direct you and avoid some of the errors. In the other the other thing that is reality is, Shaquille said read. It's true, you want to read, but I want you to be careful, because I've seen, like, I had this student once who kept reading, and at the end of a year he was still reading. So
Mhm.
I want you to direct your reading. So how do you do that? In the ancient days, the way you directed your reading was people used to write in 3x5 cards, some kind of summary of the article. You don't need to do that anymore, because you can drop the PDFs into Mendeley or Zotero, and you have the paper captured. But you don't want to just, you want to read enough to start defining the gap. You want to find the frameworks or theories that exist. You have to start putting that down. It's better to start, I don't care if you take an Excel spreadsheet or you take a Word file, if you cut and paste from the PDFs, things that you want to put in, you need something that helps you to synthesize what you're reading and connect it so that it's not some huge body of literature that's amorphous with no direction.
And Dr.
It's
Victor, the related question is, so how about how do you see the role of having some targeted journals in mind? And if I do have that kind of approach, how should I target certain journals? What is the criteria? And then how can I ensure that I will eventually be able to publish?
Okay, perfect. There are people who start out with, instead of, I want to do this research and I want to publish it in a journal, the best journal I can get into, they literally work backwards. They say, I am targeting management science, production operations management. These are very top journals, but it doesn't matter. Operations research. And then they look in those journals. Now, I still think this is a good idea, but not quite before I get the idea. They look in those journals to find out what's in those journals, and then they target something specifically to get it into the journal. I just, maybe because of the way I've always approached this as moving science forward, I want to have the basic idea. And then as I start to think about it, I want to think about, okay, given the kind of methodology, given the idea, what's the target journal? So right around this slide, where I'm kind of thinking through what's the research gap, what's the theories, and then what kind of methodology will I be using, I would suggest picking a target journal. And Shaquille knows, I'll suggest what I think is the best journal that has a potential to go to. And we start targeting it, and we start writing towards it. And if we're lucky, we get into that journal. And if not, there's a whole series of other journals. Like I named some very top journals. Let's just say you didn't get into the Journal of Operations Management or Production Operations Management. Well, there's International Journal of Production Operations Management. There's, International Journal of Production Research, International Journal of Production Economics, Computers and Industrial Engineering. These are all very good journals that are now a slight tier down from the ones I mentioned initially, and that you could then retarget for. So, and then you can pick another one. And targeting for a journal is difficult when you're first learning, because there's a whole rewriting to fit the style of writing in the journal, citing the literature in that journal to prove that your research idea fits within the stream of research within the journal. So I hope that answers what you're asking.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Dr. Victor, my personal experience is I think you should probably be first refining your idea, reading and getting guidance, working with the advisor, working with the senior researcher, getting tips, understanding where to focus on, what kind of material you should be reading. As Dr. Victor said, don't just read on, keep reading. That won't probably get you anywhere. Have a targeted reading with the help of the advisory from your either advisor or from senior researchers. And once you have a little bit of refined idea of what it is, what kind of methodology you're going to use, what kind of theory or framework you're targeting, then you should be really concerned about the journal. I think that should come later.
Correct. I think, and I'm not saying that other people don't do it differently. I wanted to be clear that there are people who pick the journal before they start doing anything. What kind of analytical technique? I talked about, like, okay, if I can't conduct a survey because I can't get enough chief information officers, top executives, maybe I do interviews. If I can conduct a survey because it's something that affects a broader audience or for which I have access to the data, even some people all have access to very top experts. A couple of former students had access to people who were suppliers, high-level suppliers, because they were, they were doctoral students when they were being funded by the Air Force. So they were already majors and colonels and had access to data that others don't always have access to. You should utilize, your unique skills, your unique experience. I know, just as an aside, my wife was 35 years a healthcare executive before she went and got a PhD. And she's like, oh, I've been in healthcare so long, I want to do something else. I'm like, do something within healthcare, leveraging your experience, because it's hard for other than that, how do you compete with a 22-year-old that's just, doing pure research? Leverage your experience if you have it. Not everybody does, but many of you have some work experience that you can then use to get some insight for ideas, for where you can get data. So, this is talking about like structural equation modeling, regression, factor analysis. This is the presumption of this techniques are typically that you've done survey research, but I'm using regression on NHATs, secondary data set. So, and we've done SEM on NHATs. So it really does depend. We've even done some SEM and qualitative work, more complicated thing. Standardized instruments. So this is where it gets very difficult. This is a very hard decision for new researchers. Ideally, you don't want to develop all your own skills, because if you're developing your own skills, you have to validate them. You have to write the items. You have to have item cleaning, item proofing, reliability and validity measures have to be good, and items will fall out. And if you do an entire survey where you write a bunch of questions from scratch, you probably don't have something that works. So instead, you look at other surveys that measure items of interest to you. So one of the examples I have is service quality. The service quality was measured for years in the 80s, late 80s, Paris Sermon, Zementhal, and Barry. And then I was one of the first people who then conducted that measure of service quality related to IT services. And we were able to publish the results of that in MIS Quarterly and in Decision Sciences Journal, because it was an existing scale that we had contextualized to a new context where it hadn't been done before. But ideally, you merge things from, you don't just take an existing survey and conduct it in the same venue it's always been done, because you're not contributing enough. So on the and simply moving from one venue to a similar venue isn't much of a contribution. So the trade-off is using existing research as the foundation, the existing skills that are out there, but then in bringing in sufficient new that the measures you have build new theory, new models. So occasionally, just like I gave you the IS measure, occasionally using an established survey in a new venue is almost enough, but only occasionally. It's typical that you got to use constructs from existing surveys, merge them together to unique combinations to create what is effectively a new theory, a new structural model that better works in the new context. And we talked a little bit about innovative data sources and experimental design. So there's many, we think of experimental design in terms of like in laboratories and in physical research, but it really exists in many venues. So evolutionary operations, they do it in manufacturing where they have an experimental design, but they do very small incremental changes to optimize the production line. Still experimental design. In survey work, experimental design can be as simple as the following, and we did this. I have a video that educates people, and I have a second video, and one is professionally made. Well, they're both professionally made of about the same quality. They both cover the same content, but one is humorous and the other is very serious. We actually did this study. My wife and I did this one. And then we test people's knowledge before they get the video and after. And the objective is to determine whether the subjects, the people who respond, have learned more from the humorous one or the serious one. And so the serious one had a doctor speaking, and the humorous one had two people playing out a skit, giving the same information. And both videos have the same content. And then we conducted a survey of a structure that created some structural models, and we tried to judge the impact of survey 1 versus 2 in the learning difference as well as in terms of that structural model. So experiments come in many forms and can be done in many different ways. Certainly, you want a standard design if possible. You want it as simple as possible, but not so simple that it appears that it doesn't contribute sufficiently to the science. It's always this trade-off. The number of variables that you don't control for could affect what you're doing. So for example, in terms of the learning effect of those videos, one, the people need access to a computer and internet or they don't watch YouTube videos. Two, the learning effect may be different for people who are in their 20s, where the knowledge may be newer than people in their 50s or people in their 80s. And so age is a variable. Education, prior education, computer self-efficacy. Here's an exact example. So Bandura developed a self-efficacy measure. It's got 15 items. Somebody published what they call computer self-efficacy, a variant of Bandura's measure. It had about 5 or 6 items. We incorporated that because how you feel about computers may affect your ability to learn from YouTube videos. And so same thing with your education, same thing with your age. So there's many different ways to control. You could control by keeping those things constant. Everybody's the same age. Everybody has the same experience. Another way to control is to have it as a control variable in your model, as a covariate, depending on the terminology and the kind of model. And ultimately, we frequently look for causal relationships, that A causes B. All right, so one of the things I put in here is in the conduct of research, there's responsible conduct of research. You know, I was working with a student who got her master's in another country, and the faculty told her, well, you know, this is only for a master's thesis. You don't have to get an IRB. We cannot publish that data. No matter what people tell you, I would like you to get IRB approval, because then if you want to publish it in a journal, journals ask for, in fact, you can't even get through a healthcare journal without submitting, even if you're using secondary data, you have to have an exemption letter from the IRB that you upload, or you can't get through the gate of what's your IRB approval. In the IRB approval is a letter, it says I don't need it. I know it sounds crazy, but I literally had conducted two different kinds of research with this person, and we had taken articles from public newspapers, but we still had a letter that said published newspapers, the data's public. We still had to have a letter that said we were exempt from IRB because of the health journal's requirement that you submitted. So get IRB approval or get a letter that says you're exempt. Responsible conduct of research. What's ethical? How do you conduct, you know, you could think about like in terms of developing medications, you know, if it goes through all these processes and then I have a medication and it seems to be harmful to some of the subjects. So then do you stop the research? Do you identify the side effects and what they are? And do you weigh that against the benefits? What if it has a great effect? I mean, is it fair not to give the other people the medication? You know, so the whole point is there are courses available. The city course is free, city training. You get the certificate. And you can take the IRB. Your university should have an internal review board for human subject research. So typically when I'm conducting research, I not only have a question, I sort of have an idea of what I think is going to work. The example I gave you about the humorous video and the serious video, there's almost zero difference between the learning of the two. It's about the same. And we found a weird thing, not what we expected. I mean, you know, you go in, you think you have an idea, and then like if you keep open minds, the data surprises you. It turns out that for the most part, the females like the humorous video more than the males. I would have thought the other way around, but whatever. The data is the data. And then you try to explain why you think that and what future research could do to explore other kinds of humor, because maybe it was the venue of the skit that made the difference. Records. So I talked about like a Word file or an Excel file. Every single thing you do in terms of data collection, data cleaning, keep notes. It's hard to remember those when you go and write the paper. You know, even if you've been writing as you go, it's hard to remember all the details. So having an Excel spreadsheet where you have a list of things that you've done, how you've done it, makes it very easy to say, well, I started out with 700 respondents on my survey. I bought them through, Prolific. It's a service you can buy data from. Lucid Theorem is another. Many of you know MTurk, Prolific's better. But of the 700, there were several that were bots, so you don't have to pay for them. You could probably ignore them, but you got to say that we know these were answered by bots. They take like 30 seconds. Several of them were faster than anybody could read and answer. How do I test that? I have several of my doc students help others by taking their surveys as fast as they can read and respond. And then we figure maybe somebody reads faster than they do. But if the average time is 10 minutes for my 3 doc students moving as fast as they can, and people are doing it in 5, probably not possible. So we start looking for patterns, an obvious pattern. Person answers 11111 on their survey. A less obvious pattern. People go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They just zigzag. But you start looking for patterns in the data, and you remove all those people, but you need notes that explains why they were removed so that if questioned, it doesn't look like I picked the ones who gave me the results I wanted. That's not okay. You have to have a legitimate reason that you document. And then we start analyzing the data, and we look at reliability and validity, and sometimes I always suggest I don't just develop a survey doing all the things I described. We pilot test, and then we analyze, and we frequently find in the pilot that some items didn't load, and then you can take them out. But if you go back and look at them, you may find that there's a subtlety in the wording that prevented it from loading with the others. So there's a whole art, if you're doing survey research, to writing those questions. Yet another talk, it's a whole different talk. All right, so now I want to present my findings. I suggest, as a starting researcher, even though you want to take this to a journal, and I think that's your objective, it should be your objective, I suggest you go to a conference. You create a poster or you do a conference presentation. It's an organized way of structuring what you're going to say, and it gives you experience, and it gives you some feedback from other researchers, kind of outlining, what was the original research question? What was the motivation to do it? What was the literature that supported it? What was the hypothesis that you did? What was the methodology that you did with regard to data collection, data analysis? What were the results? What were the conclusions? And what is the value contribution to theory and research? Also, limitations. But when I write limitations, I don't just say, well, a limitation of this is the data sample. I write that, the sample could potentially be biased for this reason. People have to have access to a computer to work in surveys in Prolific, but we believe it's generalizable to a very large percentage for this reason. I always have a limitation with a reason I believe. It doesn't negate the findings of the current research. I don't just list things that could be wrong, which I see beginning researchers do because that's what they're asked to do. All right, so academic writing and how do we get effective at it? My advisor, I used to try to write, and I was not a good writer. I had to become a good writer. I, was a product of an inner city, Philadelphia, poor neighborhood, public project school. So my advisor used to tell me, never say in one sentence what you can say in 2. Be precise and be very structured. That's why doing the conference presentation, it creates a structure you can follow and you can start writing around it. Rather than just writing, create an outline. A lot of my students don't know what an outline is, but they know what a PowerPoint is. That's why create the PowerPoints. Write the PowerPoints. It's an outline. It's just an outline by a different name. Visual aids, great. Presenting it at a conference gives you feedback. referees when you submit to a journal if you get past desk reject from the editor, because the desk reject is like, well, it doesn't fit. It doesn't usually help you much. But if it goes to reviewers, those reviewers will give you feedback, and you have don't just argue with them. You have an obligation to try to consider what they say and address each point by point to improve your work, because the objective is to improve the work to get into the journal, not to prove what you did was the way it should be done. And there will be challenges. You will, face obstacles. Like I was telling you, I started my dissertation, I was doing mathematical modeling and couldn't figure it out. So I was like, okay, simulation. Then I was walking the halls because it used to be real time. We had to pay for computers in these big computer banks. And I would be walking the halls at 11 at night because it was cheaper to run. We didn't even have a remote until TimeNet came out. So waiting for my programs to run. Yes, they were in cards, and then they went to a line editor. So anyway, I was walking the halls because of between 11 and whatever, 6 or 7 in the morning, it was cheaper to run. And I was blowing up the computer because it took me a little while to figure out the increments in the simulation were too fine. When I say a little while, this wasn't hours. This was 6 months of work. There's no do simulation, it's easy. Do mathematical modeling, it's easy. Do survey work, none of it is easy. It all has its challenges. It's all difficult. It all has things that will get you valuable data and contribute to the science if you do it through a rigorous process. I talked about it being iterative, having an idea, refining the idea, developing the research, further developing it, starting to collect data. Even collecting data, sometimes we collect data. We don't just say, oh, we're going to Prolific and we're going to collect 700 samples. We collect 50 and analyze them. We literally collect the first 50 and analyze, or the first 100. And then we determine the data's coming in the way we think, we'll collect the rest, or no, we've got a problem. We will modify a couple of the items, collect the rest of the data after modification. It doesn't ruin the whole survey for the first 50, because there may be things I can do with some of the other constructs, but ultimately I want that as fine a product as I can get. So, get a research mentor, somebody who's working. That's what early feedback is. Colleagues, a researcher, continue to revise and refine what you do. Learn from your setbacks. They're just learning opportunities. Nothing shuts you down. You just keep moving to contribute to the science and help. You're basically, when I talk about contributing to the science, you have an obligation to society to move it forward, so that the next generation lives a better life than the current, and onward forever. That's how we got where we are. That's how we'll continue to go. So the quality over quantity, it's important, but I also know that you have to be realistic in terms of, I have a lot of students who go to schools where they're not tier 1 research schools. And as such, they have to publish more journal articles than they would at some other schools. But while they're teaching 3 courses a term or 4 courses a term, I have one student who's at a school that, interestingly enough, counts proceedings just about as much as journal articles. And so he's competing with people who publish a lot of proceedings. He still wants to publish in journals. So we always figure out how to take a data set we're working on and do a small piece of it for him to present at a conference and publish the proceedings, but then do a bigger part of it for that journal article so that he doesn't lose. But largely, I agree with the idea. Go to the best journals you can, get into those best journals, but don't just. I had a colleague well over 30 years ago, 40 years ago, over 40, it doesn't matter. I've been doing this a very long time. I taught my first course in 74. I was a full-time lecturer in 81 and then became, went to industry for a couple of years and an assistant professor. But listen, I had a colleague who wrote a really very good idea and he sent it to a journal and they rejected it. He put it in a drawer and did something else. And then he put that in a drawer and did something else. And then he asked me for help. And these were good ideas. And they had sat too long. And so what he should have done, instead of just saying, oh, I talked about FD50s, but he was at the equivalent, Journal of American Statistical Association or Technometrics. And when they turned him down, he could have rewritten that and gotten it into another very good journal. So it's about perseverance, it's about patience, it's about a structured process. So I talked about all the things, very high level. Each one of these could literally be a course. Responsible conduct of research, IRB, identifying the research gap, a research methods course, a methodology course. If you go through a PhD at our university in business, there's a research methods course, there's a course in regression, there's a course in multivariate, there's a course in structural equation modeling, there's a course in experimental design, there's a course in teaching. So just to give you a foundation to do some of this, and there's more. So it doesn't mean, but it's not all about coursework. I believe you learn more by doing projects. So when I taught experimental design or I taught multivariate, I always had my students complete a project as part of the course. Not everybody agrees with that because it takes away from covering the material in a book, but I believe that by the time you're in a PhD program, reading a book and taking a test on it is something you're expert at, but actually getting the work done is something that you're in the learning process of. So I hope this was helpful. I know I'm probably a couple minutes over. Any questions?
Very, very helpful, Dr. Victor. Greatly appreciated. Folks, we can probably, Dr. Victor, are you okay for two or three more questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Folks, any question for Dr. Victor? So
it's probably a lot, so don't feel bad if you feel like, well, there's a lot here and it's very general. As you start working, you get questions. Somebody wrote an interesting point. I think it was Shaquille, you put this. Another thing about research, unless you're working in a very odd problem, I'm doing some sampling strategy research and people haven't published in that for 20 years. Unlikely. But unless you're working in a very odd problem, you need to keep your research citations current. And so you really want it to be, last 5 years. But it depends on the problem. If you're looking at, supply chains, working post-COVID is different than pre-COVID, than during COVID. So it depends on the question. It depends on, but typically for journals, you want relatively newer articles and you want to be careful to always cite the journal you're in, targeting, so that you can anchor the research within it.
Yeah. Arslan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask this question? I think
somebody asked the following: How do they find the perfect journal? There's no perfect journal. You're balancing the quality of the journal with the fit. There are very narrow journals. Example. Environmental pollution. I published a model of using REMA and regression versus neural net models in environmental pollution. It's a good fit for that, but it doesn't work as well as in a college of business. It's got a fair number of sites. So I got another data set from the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, from a different city, and I cited the first work and I redid it with another data set and improved it and published it in the European Journal of Operational Research. A much better journal in terms of, I think the environmental pollution has more citations, but a much better journal in terms of career fit in a college of business. So you know.
And there's a list available on internet called ABDC, Australian Business Deans
Thank you,
Council.
yes.
Yeah, you can
And
download
under
that
ranked
and you can,
journals, that's right.
yeah, rank journals.
And like there's A stars and A's and B's, and it gives you a sense of the journal quality, and you can look for the topic you want, title you want, you know, healthcare or modeling, and see what's there. The other thing somebody asked about AI tools. Yes, I can suggest some AI tools. I am a believer in using, for example, as a minimum, Grammarly. You know, some people say, well, we have faculty who won't let their students use Grammarly because it's AI. But you got to clean up your writing. It's got to be written well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think you should ask AI to generate, you know, write me a paper on this. That's just silliness. But if I had a paragraph about something that I wrote, and you got to be careful what AI you use. Like I happen to use Claude, and I tell it not to retain my text nor its response, and I give it a paragraph that I wrote and ask it to rewrite it to better fit the target journal. It's using my writing, and it will do that. And you know, why would I do that? Look, I've been doing this a long time. I know that editors review papers for contribution and quality of writing and things like that in the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion, at least initially. They skim those. They may skim the rest and look at some of the rest, but that's critical. So I sent a paper many years ago to transportation research and got rejected. And it was about the contribution. I still thought it was a good paper. So I rewrote that part to emphasize it more and sent it to Decision Sciences Journal, and we got it in. And so Ben George, Rebecca Scott, and I published it in Decision Sciences Journal. So now with an AI tool, I could give it my abstract and my introduction and say, how would you suggest I rewrite this to improve and enhance the claimed contribution? And it will give you directions, and then you can do it. And then, of course, you have Grammarly cleaning up the grammar because they're getting increasingly intolerant of typos. Like small typos are like, oh, you need a professional editor. It's like you found one typo. It's like, leave me alone. But that's the way it is. Partly because Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Springer, they sell editing services for their journals. So there's a bias towards telling you it should be perfect. Even an editor doesn't always get them perfect, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
If a journal rejects my paper, I have more rejections than anybody you know. I don't know more than anybody, but I have a lot of publications. And the reality is, when I'm rejected, I just like the example I gave you. I think about what the reviewer said. I think about whether I think that what they're saying is reasonable and how I should change it. If I'm lucky, they didn't like some pieces of it, but they think it's good for the journal and they help me. And then I respond to them and I get it in. That's great. But if they reject, I try to address as much as possible the criticism before I go to the next journal. And if they find errors that I think I can't address, I then say that I thought about that and I view that as a limitation or an area for future research because it's an unanswered question from the current study. And that way, at least the next set of reviewers know that I considered those issues.
So, Dr. Victor, we're past 10 minutes. I know it's a long time for you, and I greatly appreciate you coming to our platform and giving this talk. Folks, please remember.
And for the benefit of the last question, I don't know. That's hysterical. To get AI to generate your data, I don't know. To get AI to analyze your data, maybe, but within the confines of IRB appropriateness. And know how to analyze your own data because AI will just do silly things with it if you don't understand.
You have to be careful. I saw that question as well. I said maybe I should send the response separately. Yeah, you have to be careful what can be done with AI, what cannot be, because a lot of journals will be they're raising their eyebrows when they see a huge, input from AI. So with that, I think let's wrap it up. Dr. Victor, again, thank you very much. We
Thank
really
you
greatly
all. Happy
appreciate
to
your
see
time.
you.
Yep.
Shakib, thanks for inviting me. The group, I appreciate it. Kashif, thanks for coming as well.
Yeah,
Thank you,
he
Dr.
was helping with the answers as well. Thank you, Kashif. Okay, folks, have a good rest of the day and evening. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Victor. Bye-bye.